All right, we're back. Welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Summer is in full swing, but we are back here to talk about some football. Thomas, how you doing?
Double E, I am doing well. You're in Minnesota. We're waiting for you to get back here to Atlanta. Hopefully that's soon. When are you coming back to the office?
Well, tomorrow morning, actually. I just talked it over. Tej Seth, one of our great data scientists, he's visiting some family in Atlanta. I'm flying in tonight, and so I'll be at the office tomorrow morning. We get to throw the football around. We get to our computers per individual in a meeting will drop below 1. That'll be pretty cool, and it'll be a lot of fun.
It'll be fun. And by the way, we need to get a real football in here, not throw around this wooden football that's about 40 pounds, this trophy football we have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the office is a great environment. And I honestly, obviously I moved about a month and a half ago. And obviously the times that we get to hang out at the office are great because we get to learn about this game we love. By the way, so before I get too far into this, we're going to talk about the history of data on this show. At Sumer Sports, we have a very exciting fall for people. We have sumersports.com where we currently have content going up there. In about a month or less, we're going to have some data, some tools for people who want to use it for fantasy football, who are very into just the sport. We had a couple really cool articles just come out. Sean Syed wrote a really awesome piece last week about Kyle Shanahan and his schemes. You can go to sumersports.com/thezone to go ahead and look at that. I actually just wrote up a preview of the AFC South. We're going to have one of those previews every single week until the season goes. AFC South, the only reason we started with the AFC South, Thomas, I'm not trying to be biased, but they do have the lowest projected win total of any team in all of football, both by the markets and in our simulation. So I started with them. An upstart team in Jacksonville, a lot of fun to watch. In fact, we had a cool football life today because Doug Peterson signed his son to play tight end for Jacksonville, formerly of the USFL. So that is kind of cool. I thought that was a fun football story. Today, we are going to talk about tracking data today, Thomas, but we're going to talk about the evolution towards that first because I think it's a really cool look into how football has evolved, why we're here at Sumer Sports, some of the advancements we've made as a community before then. And the first part I want to talk about, Thomas, is this idea that data in football has been new. Data in football has not been new, right? Like going back all the way to your time, for example, with the Cleveland Browns, Detroit, eventually New England, where you really cut your teeth, you earned a couple Super Bowl rings, and into the early part of Atlanta, even before we had Pro Football Focus or NFL Fast or anything like that, we were collecting data about players, were we not?
No question we were collecting data. And there was a lot of data, at least in our minds early on, that was accessible to us. The problem was, as you know, we did not know how to use it. Just like today, there's so much data, at their disposal in the NFL that people just don't know exactly how to use it. I mean, some of the data people in the building do. The football people are learning about using it more, right? So the more comfortable football people get using it, the more they're going to tap into their group, their data group inside, and the more they're going to rely on it. So let me pull back for a minute because this is a really interesting topic. Data's been around a long time. We know what AI, you can start talking about AI and now because everyone's talking about ChatGPT and GPT-3, GPT-4. We interestingly enough, back in the day in the 80s and 90s, when I started in the NFL in the early 90s, all the way through early 2000s, we were still very, very driven by old school football, right? People, even the really, really smart people in football kind of kept that to the side a little bit. They wanted to be perceived as football people. And the crazy thing is, as smart as people were becoming and the more data that was available, people kind of had to tuck that away, right? If you were a person in football and in scouting who had an early analytic bent to you, you would almost be ostracized. Here's a really interesting thing. Going as far back as I would say back into the early 90s when I really started in this, we used to get, if you were a young scout and you were utilizing event data or basic stats to augment your report writing, oh, no. Major no. Because people said, well, that guy, the reason he's using the data in the stats is because he doesn't trust his eye, because he's not truly a good evaluator. These are some of the old schools, right? It's obviously changed a lot. But I found that fascinating even in the early 90s, mid 90s, and even into 2000. You had to kind of walk a certain line when you had more of an all-encompassing approach and you weren't just a football guy. So it's an interesting topic for sure.
Well, I always find it interesting because we both, like, it's funny because you and I think both love football in like equal measure. And yet obviously I come at it from a little bit different of a perspective, but I feel like it's the difference between like art and science in a way. And I can truly appreciate what somebody who would think that way thinks, right? Because I remember when I was when I was a professor, we had another colleague in my building who would produce what was called mathematical art. And essentially what he would do is he'd draw something and then he'd use mathematics to like rotate it and tessellate it and do all these things, and it would create this like really cool picture. But that person was always viewed as a little bit less of an artist. Like it was not viewed as actual art the same way that, somebody who was doing, something more traditional was thought of, because again, you're augmenting kind of that human experience. And I can totally understand it. Like I think of, and we'll get to the data on this in a second, but like even think about like a run play. Like we both have said on the show that runs are not as efficient as passes. But to a football person, a perfectly blocked run play is about as beautiful as it gets, right? So if you're engaging in football, and I'm not saying this negatively, I'm saying this like I'm saying this, I'm not making a value judgment. If you interact with football as an art form, then you might bristle at this idea that somebody's coming in with their notebooks back in the 90s or their computer now and would say, well, that thing that you really love doing, it doesn't get blocked up as much as you think. And hence, the more you run the football, the more inefficient you're going to be as an offense. And so I have a ton of empathy for somebody who would say something like that, to your point. It's just that the hard part about this, and this is true about every single sport, Thomas, is that they're all doing it now. And every NFL team is augmenting their scouting with some sort of statistical analysis. And so in a competitive game like football, you can appreciate the art in the football, and I do as much as anybody. But if you're not up to date with the latest in data, you're going to fall behind.
We were still in those early 2000s when I was in New England. We were doing some, I think, pretty special research and approaches. Of course, we kept it very tucked away, and we never allowed it to become bulletin board material. But I thought we did a really good job with it. I get to Atlanta in 2008 with Mike Smith, and we're always looking to get better and better. But there were caps on everything, right? Back to how much do we truly trust the numbers and the data that's coming in? Again, because we didn't know how to utilize it. But we were always looking for something better. I had mentioned before to you, I think, and this might be a right time to talk about it, I got taken to the principal's office. The commissioner pulls me to the office, Jeff Pash and everyone, and they're like, Thomas, we know you guys are doing very special things there with polar heart rate monitoring and tracking within your practices. And you've also taken this to the preseason games, but we're going to stop your ass right there. We were not allowed to go further than that point because they did not want us tracking in game time views, which was crazy because that was where we needed to go. Crazy, I say, for us. So we were relegated to playing with all of our instruments on the practice field to get all this information. But interestingly enough, and you know this, the NFL is very, very smart. The last thing they want is one team to go in and make inroads to something. And this was back in 2009. I remember it clearly when it happened. And then, of course, the league started really focusing on next gen stats, and the rest is history, of course. A lot of really cool stuff, though. A lot of the tracking that went on in practices, it was a perfect segue into what we're doing in today's world.
Well, and I think obviously you were very awake to kind of why, right? Like your great seasons as the Falcons general manager in large part was because was when you had great players who were healthy, and some of the seasons where you guys came up short were when your great players got injured. I mean, and we're not cracking, like we're nowhere close. Like I'm going to newsflash everybody, we're not anywhere close to cracking the code on injuries in on the public sphere or behind the scenes. And for you to go out and try to seek that edge, to me, is just a smart thing to do, because you know that one of the and I think in math the idea is like, okay, is injury risk reducible, right? There's some schools of thought that think no, like that think you can't reduce the risk of injury, it's part of playing the game. And then there are some teams that disagree and will search for that edge. And to your point, like you're always trying. And it was always funny with the Patriots because Bill would always, kind of talk down analytics, but you could tell analytics is not just about coding things up. It's not just about, it's about meticulously. And I know in that football life that you were in, the 95 Browns, that Phil Savage was talking about how Bill made him, pad games in a meticulous way that was like him. And he said, I'm never going to sleep again because of all the meticulousness. It reminded me of my first few years at PFF where I'm charting games and I'm like, Jesus, I'm never going to get another nap in my entire life. And it's like, but you become intimately related with the game. And that's whether you do that with algorithms or you do that with your mind, your eyes, you get intimately related to the corners of the game. And that's where all the money is made, right? All the fat of the game. We all know the game, that part of the game. It's those corners that you meticulously go through. And, one thing that's been said about the Belichick paradigm, that scouting system, is like, well, it's been there for a long time and it's consistent. And that's something that, as we're trying to build stuff at Sumer, that's, of course, what we're trying to strive for. But that longitudinal data, that long-term data of knowing, like, this guy's an X in this system, and I could talk about an X in the system 5 years ago in the same way, because I know that system has been refined, and I know that system's been trained into people. That is incredibly valuable, even if no one is writing any algorithms, putting any code together. Like that to me is analytics in and of itself. And it's started the process, in my opinion, because when you guys were doing that, you guys were kicking everybody's ass. You were going to every single AFC championship game, a bunch of Super Bowls, won a few, won many. And now, like, okay, then it transitions into the Pro Football Focus / Sports Info Solutions / NFL Fast Star days, which is what's called event data. So you have this idea of players where you're essentially grading the whole, right? So you take a player and you watch him and you put a grade on him, and you might put a grade on him in different facets or whatever. And then what really exploded the system kind of in the middle of the last decade was this idea of every single play you would have tags for things. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about event data. Event data is basically charting everything that happens. And most of the time it's all happening on the ball. So you talk about like pressure on the quarterback. You talk about play action fakes to the running back. You're talking about, was there a stunt? What were teams rotating their coverage from 2 high to 1 high at the snap or something like that? All that stuff is what's called event data. It's something that a human and eventually a computer can chart. And that exploded this idea, because you could go through all the different permutations and say, well, if Keanu Neal was in the box and Brian Poole was up in a mug position against the slot receiver, what was your EPA or yards per play on that? And you could go through and look and see what were we really effective on plays like that. And it really exploded our ability to analyze football.
Do you think, when you look back at that, do you think it was asinine of NFL clubs trying to put together their rosters, their acquisitions, their trades without truly, before we even get to player tracking, talking about event, do you think it was crazy that we weren't utilizing it more, that we were still relying on some old school scouting techniques that were tried and true, which were completely battle weathered and battle tested, at least according to us? I look at it now, being out of the business now for 3 years, and everything that we are tapping into now. And I know we're going to segue into player tracking, but I want to stay here on when you're talking about the event side of it, and still making a lot of those moves with the Falcons, from 2008 all the way up to, let's just say, even 2016, right? 17, when we would look at the data, of course. but we never really were juxtaposing the data to make the true decision between one player and another. Some people did, and I liked doing it. I felt like I was a little bit more on front edge than other people. But when it all came down to it, I came back to, well, this is what I saw on video, right? Because we were always taught it's what you see in games. All this other stuff is good background, but it's what you see. As a data scientist, is that unfathomable for you that we didn't tap into that more?
I mean, I watch a lot of games, right? So I have my own. I watch somebody and I'm like, oh, I think that player's good, even though maybe the data doesn't back it up. So I have some empathy for that opinion. But then there were always edge cases. I think, and I don't know what would have been actionable about this, but you remember a guy that you drafted out of Clemson, Vic Beasley, led the NFL in sacks in 2016 with 15 and a half. But he was 18th in pressures. And so when you think about, okay, and just for the people there, pressures are something like play by play. All of these vendors will track, right? So did Vic Beasley make the quarterback move off his spot? That's a pressure. Was it a cleanup pressure? Did somebody like Grady Jarrett come up the middle incredibly fast and force the quarterback into Vic Beasley? That be what would be called an unblocked pressure or a cleanup pressure. And so there were all these various ways of being able to measure pass rush ability. And for all of history, we remember the great players by who sacked the quarterback. We remember Reggie White was like 21 and a half sacks in 87. We remember Michael Strahan landing on Brett Favre, falling down for him in 2001 for his record-breaking sack. We remember by sacks. We don't remember by pressures, right? And one of the key reasons why everybody liked Jarrett in our buildings at PFF was he generated a lot of pressure at Clemson. And so there was like that hidden variable. But those hidden variables can also work as cold water, right? You look at, from your perspective, and we already looked at your record. It's on sumersports.com. If you look at the 5th-year option article, Thomas hit on all but 2, right? So you hit on a bunch of first rounders. But from your perspective, you draft Vic in round 1. He leads the league in sacks. Yeah. And some nerd is going to tell you, well, he's actually not that good of a pass rusher. And like, that to me would have been one of those things where, in a different world, you're like, okay, how can I trade Vic, right? Because there's going to be some team that's going to look at the 15 and a half sacks, a team that maybe struggled on defense or something like that, and they're going to give you a first-round pick for him or something like that, right? And so I always thought that there were opportunities to buy players who were undervalued and to sell players who were maybe a little overvalued. And a lot of that was hidden in the tracking data. Or like a guy like, could get a lot of interceptions, but on like Marcus Peters, when he played for the Chiefs, get like 10 interceptions, but he'd give up 1,000 yards in coverage. We, until 2012 or so, weren't even charting what the guy's coverage stats were. Back in the day, it was Delta O'Neal, right? You look back in, Cincinnati, Cleveland, he'd have 10 interceptions and the next year he'd be benched. It's like, well, couldn't you have flipped him when he made the 10 interceptions the year before and gotten some value for him before you found out what was already true about him, which was that he's a gambler that gives up a lot of yards and gets a lot of picks. And so I always felt like there were ways in which we could extract value from your current roster and other teams' roster that were embedded in that data that maybe were not as taken advantage of as they maybe should have been.
So speed, distance, acceleration, as we start talking about tracking, before we go to tracking, we always thought you have an eye, right, as an evaluator, or you sit down with your head coach as you're building the teams and are like, someone downstairs on our performance side who was going out with us, and we were working with force plates, right? We were the first team to ever work with force plates and Phil Wagner with a really cool company that we're actually looking to tie into here soon and have a conversation with Sumer, thanks to Sean Clement bringing it up recently. But we did a lot of work that way. And our people down in performance would say, hey, remember what we did on the force plate with Vic Beasley, et cetera, et cetera. And yet we would go back. Ultimately, we had this tug to go back to watching the video. It is not happening today, which I think is really good. I think it's got a much more academic approach, which I think is really important. It feels as though you get a really good evaluator, again, who's going to augment, who's going to take the data out there, who's going to take speed, distance, and acceleration that we really don't know how we're tracking it. Now we are tracking it. We used to just say, sorry for babbling about this, but we used to sit around in our groups and watch, and we would all banter about who had more acceleration and, whatever it may have been. We were trying to do it with our eyes. And it's just, it's so ridiculous that we had so much data there, even in the final couple of years, that we didn't tap into. I feel a little short-sighted on that, of course, which is a good sign.
History is always weird, right? Because if you judge history with the knowledge of the present, you're always going to be a little bit more, you're always going to look at it unfavorably when that's not necessarily fair. I mean, like, I remember, when you guys were re-signing Ricardo, like, I sent a bunch of reports to Johnny about Ricardo because he had, like, its safety evaluation was really hard, right? So, like, it was fun to see when you guys gave him that extension. He ultimately, it ended up not working out because of injuries, to the first point that we made, which is about, injury risk and everything. But he had earned that. And, like, prior to 2000 and whatever, the only metrics we had for safeties were tackles, which are kind of misleading, sacks, which almost never happened for safeties unless it was like Adrian Wilson or somebody like that, and interceptions, which are misleading. So, like, you guys in Atlanta did a pretty good job, I would say, relative to the times, but there was always more juice to squeeze out of the orange. And this gets us to the tracking data bit, because event data, and I'm going to talk about this in terms of soccer for just a brief second because it's important, but the adage in soccer is that 97% of the events happen off the ball. So if you're only and soccer event data, bless StatsBomb and StatsBomb more than Opta, but like all those vendors, their event data was almost entirely on the ball. Whether you got a tackle, whether you pass, expected goals is entirely on the ball. Event data. You're missing 97% of what's happening on the pitch if you don't have tracking data. Football is a little bit better because you have the quarterbacks holding on the ball the majority of the time, and he influences everything and receiving and all that stuff. It's not 97%, but a significant amount of what happens in football happens away from the football. And if you're just doing event data, it's incredibly hard to infer from that, right? So, for example, Pro Football Focus, when they grade their defensive backs, they kind of just do a little bit of math to grade the players that aren't targeted. That's how it was until about 3 years ago. With tracking data, you can actually look at whether or not he got turned around by the wide receiver or whatever. And so you're more able to analyze the whole of the game that's happening by that we're not even viewing in many cases because of the way the game is broadcast on TV.
Yeah, I mean, when I start thinking about that, and I start thinking about what do you think football is, and what percent is it? Just so I'm clear, not 98. I mean, we talk about backside defensive backs, right? We talk about range, all of the stuff that we've always been taught. Like, there's another side to evaluating. So, curious. What do you think?
I think in the running game, you can measure by hand 75% of what happens because you can watch the linemen and you can see, like, kind of, and it's weird. Like, it's a fun topic. I actually think it's a lot easier to use data to understand the run game than the passing game, because the run game, everything is unital, right? So the right tackle down blocking and the left guard pulling out and whamming that edge player that he vacates. Like, that's all one unit, right? So if you're slow off the ball or you get your ass beat and that pulling guard can't get over that's partially your fault. You know what I mean? Like, and so it's all unital. Whereas the passing game, it's so many more one-on-one matchups, left tackle, right edge, right tackle, right. And then it's wide receiver versus defensive backs and man coverage. And then it's all this kind of stuff. And then it's quarterback. But in the passing game, and this is where I really found it, where it was like linebackers and safeties, I think it's more like 50-50, where if you're a quarterback, the way that the safeties play you affects how you play the game so drastically. And it's really hard for a person with their eyes to look at safeties and be like, he's controlling 80%. So we did this cool study when I was at PFF with Timo Risque, where we looked at kind of field control. Like, so how much of the field are you controlling as a defensive back? And we found, for example, and this again is another reason, like, I'm not trying to crap on Telesco in Los Angeles. It's sort of more of like when the Patriots were really going good, they used Stephon Gilmore to control far more of the field than JC Jackson, right? So they engineered their defense where Gilmore, and so if you're a quarterback, you're thinking to yourself, do I throw to this big part of the field, but the corner's a lot better? Or do I throw to the small part of the field, but the corner is occupying that small region? And so a lot of teams would throw to the small part and get it intercepted by JC Jackson. JC Jackson earns a big contract from the Chargers. And funny, when he goes to Los Angeles to play, it's different because they're not Bill anymore, and it's I'm not saying that we would have been able to flag that, but I think future iterations of tracking data and analysis would be able to say, look, JC Jackson's not a bad corner, but he's not as good as these 7 interceptions. And here's why. The same way that the Vic Beasley thing was, Vic wasn't a bad pass rusher in 2016. Don't get me wrong, not a bad pass rusher. He just wasn't the best pass rusher in the NFL, which you would have thought by the number of sacks he had, right? And so I think it's all of these different things where you're measuring so much more because you have the where every player is 10 times every single second. You're able to see how things move, and you're able to see how the space gets occupied differently as the play evolves.
So with that in mind, do you think you can determine a player's passion, drive, effort much more with player tracking ability?
I think, great question. I think if I sat next to you and watched a game and you said to me, hey, notice on the backside of this run play, notice how in the backside of this play where the tight end crashes down and doesn't block him, that's a sign of a player that doesn't care, or that's a sign of a player that really gives a shit, right? Like that, if you said that, or, you can measure flowing to the ball. Like there are all kinds of things like I think you could do if I sat next to you for a day and a half and we watched film. I feel like we could code some of that into our analysis. What do you think?
I think you could. I mean, it feels like you could. It would feel like it would be that much more of a strong sort of validated discussion point for me. We had this discussion with one of our incredibly intelligent data scientists. We were talking about what if coaches eventually took all of that tracking information and that's what they were basing their grading of their games off of, right? Meaning, what if they could do that and we could run the information and say, okay, there's all the information you need. You're going to still watch the video of the game to look at your players, but you're going to take what has been provided through player tracking to determine whether, your guy was a positive or a negative on a certain player, or whatever your grading setup is. But the time that would be spent or saved on that, which is one of the things like companies like telemetry and, where that group is and how they're all about saving time and being much more efficient with their approach, right? So,
or even PFF, where like I remember at a scouting combine, it was one of the special teams coaches for a team said that he was interviewing a player at the combine, and they said, "Oh yeah, I've played millions of special team snaps, and I was really good." And they're like, "Well, actually, PFF has you with 4 special team snaps your whole career," and like it's even stuff like that where you think about. Your guy has to go in and watch TCU all 10 games and chart how many times 76 was on the field versus you just have a report on it. It's that kind of stuff where, and I mean this, like you're far smarter than having to do that, right? Like make somebody who's a neophyte in football do that as a part of their apprenticeship with PFF versus somebody who, because what I think of is, for example, if you're, and I'm not trying to give away, but I'm working on a project now with Tage and hopefully you and a former NFL lineman, which is kind of funny. But like if somebody says, look, I've actually gotten really a lot better on my kick step in like I've gotten deeper, I've gotten more efficient, and you draw the map and you're like, well, actually, dude, like you've actually gotten more widely distributed here, and we'd love you to tighten it up. Like even stuff like that where. And then I think the job of the analyst or the scout or the GM or anybody who's cut their teeth evaluating players, who knows football much more than somebody like me, your job morphs more into like finding the next thing as opposed to having to chart it so much, right? So let's say that you come up with a really interesting way to evaluate whether or not a player's, let's say their head movement, like whether or not, like if you're a tackle, let's say, and you're supposed to pick up a stunt or something, how does your head move? If you're able to pick that up, none of the tracking data providers are doing it, right? Let the tracking data providers do stuff that's been solved a million times, and let you, who's much better at understanding football, track the stuff that no one else is tracking. That's kind of how I see it. You have like what are called table stakes, which is like, how often do they get a pressure, eventually how good is their effort, all this stuff, and you add to that the stuff that you only know via your expertise, having been an evaluator forever.
So we had this conversation before, which leads into what I also want to ask you then is the backside of a play, or if you're watching the tracking, or if you're paying attention to the tracking information, Eric, but you're not really watching the video. Tracking is saying this guy made a play or he didn't make a play, but the fact is he made an incredibly athletic move to get to a spot, to cut something off, to turn it back in to someone else to make a play, right? Or vice versa, right? Some of the players that make plays and they're really ugly making them, they're basically falling down. They're getting credit for making a big play, and yet it all just happened kind of by chance. I don't know if we're going in the right direction with that, but that is something that is an interesting thing for us as football people. We're like, man, we want to see that. To be able to combine that with video is a big thing for us.
Yeah, I think that the reason, right? I think what you've highlighted is the reason that like traditional scouting is not going to ever go anywhere, like in mass, right? Like you might not have to chart the play by, like there might be some stuff that ends up being automated away for you, but you're still going to want, like what you really want is a graph that says, here are our internal grades and here are the tracking data grades. And they should lie almost entirely on a line where the tracking data grades and the scouting grades agree. It's where the differences are, right? And the thing is like if you have a scouting system, and we have I know we're going to cut this a little bit short today just because it's Monday and it's summer and everything. We do have some good questions. One of the great questions was that, and this is from Colin Dunphy, I believe. No, Eddie Healy. He says, might not be quite the intended topic, but would love to hear about how you use data to scout the scouts, essentially. Yeah. And I think that's, we have this, and scouting has been professionalized, which is amazing, right? And it's one of the reasons, for example, Pro Football Focus hasn't exactly made their way into the NFL to the degree that they want to, even though they have 32 clients. It's like there's a professionalism to scouting. And much like you have professionalism in teaching and education and other things, like there is an evaluation phase of that practitioner. And I think tracking data can be that, where it's like, look, our tracking data grades say this guy's amazing, and your scouting grades say he's trash. Okay, I got to be semantically responsible. But they say he's not good, or he's not as good as the track, and he's off the line. You have 10 players who are off the line. Let's go through the reasons why. And I'd rather that be my evaluation as a scout than all hundreds of players I scout is only the ones where it disagrees, right? Because it's more efficient, and it's like, well, we've already solved the problem of the other players, right? I'm in agreement with the tracking data on those. But let's say I really truly think so-and-so is better than the models do. Let's talk about it. Let's have and then let's document it, and let's go ahead and talk about whether or not over time. And my guess would be that scouting would be better than the data for most of those players. It's going to be, but the lessons that we're going to learn are going to be the lessons among the disagreements.
So the question, his name was Eddie, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, Eddie Healy.
Yeah, Eddie Healy. Nice question. Actually, we always talk about scouting the scouts, right? We always talk about how we can hone in on that much better. Way back when I started, there were certain teams that weren't measuring any of what we were doing, because this was their reasoning from some of the GMs and some of the personnel directors. I don't want to sort of mess with this scout's mind by knowing that I'm hanging over his head, that I'm evaluating his ability, because he won't give me his true opinion. Think about that.
Well, that's part of the art, right? That's part of the
Exactly.
stand-up comic who's like, I don't want like the stand-up, like, and I love stand-up. It's like one of my favorite art forms. It's like the stand-up comic who's like, you're not going to evaluate me, right? If you get it, you get it, right? And I think that there's a little bit of that in player eval, right? It's like, it's my evaluation of the player. It can't be judged. You know what and not can't as in like you shouldn't judge me. It's more like it's art, right? And so it's to everybody what it is to everybody. It's special to them type of thing. And I think that that's part of the vibe there.
Well, and to Eddie's question, and I hope that I was hitting on what he was talking about, because as a GM, I always wanted to make sure I had a really good grasp of who was strong at what position, who, offense, defense, positions, whatever it was, because everyone in scouting evaluates all positions, just so everyone knows that. We don't have like just a DB guy or just a linebacker guy. In the spring, we start having them be experts at a position because we just want, consistency. That's how we did it. But everyone is scouting everyone else. The interesting thing is, if I'm grading the scout to see how he's doing, he might have hit on that player, right? The movement, the abilities, but then that player ended up getting into a system that wasn't conducive. He didn't have a good position coach. There are so many elements that might have weighed into the player not being successful. In our analysis through data is saying that this scout has missed on 68% of his guys. And I'm like, God, but how much were his fault, pure misses, and how much were so many other factors, right? Which maybe can come back to you. What does that mean? We as football people often think the data people are going to come in, and if they're not 85 to 90% correct, well, why do we use them? How ridiculous is that as well?
Yep.
You would say,
yeah, I mean, it's political, right? Like if you look at the way that politics is in this country, if somebody's a different political party than you, they have to be error-free for you to listen to them. Whereas everybody deals with a cornucopia of errors on their political spectrum. Same with religion, everything. Like, it's the same thing with analytics and non-analytics. It's like if I come to you and I say, look, I have a model for player eval and it says Baker Mayfield's good, you're gonna be like, there's the door, right? But like if I hit on the other 9 guys, it doesn't matter to you, right? Like and I think that's just the nature of competing camps, right? And of course, like what we want to do at Sumer is have it be collaborative and not competitive. I remember though, to your point here, a very good, I think it was Daniel Jeremiah who said, whenever he graded an offensive lineman poorly, and he went and played for, I think it's Jeff Stoutland, but I could be wrong. But one of those great offensive line coaches, like well-renowned, Bill Callahan, obviously your guy Scarnecchia, he would always get mad because he's like, that guy's going to be good, and it's going to make my evaluation look bad. And it's exactly kind of what you said. And I think analytics can help because what we can do, and we've done this before, if anybody wants to come to us about coaching, we've done a good job on evaluating the coaches. But like analytics can kind of help you say, well, this guy's a 10 on the field, but his coach is also a 10. How does that shake out? And does it maybe make him an 8? Something like that. I mean, that it's not easily done, but you can contextualize those things much easier with analytics than with the human mind, where you're kind of trying to juggle those things a million times at once, to your point, where it's like this guy performed poorly, but his mom had cancer or something like that. And it's just something that's like not controllable by the scout.
So if I asked you right now, understanding where tracking is right now and how it's evolving and how the league is evolving with it, before we finish, where do you think sort of next waves of tracking can do? Where are we going with it, and how will it affect a general manager's ability to potentially scout?
Yeah. Also, and Colin Dunphy asked a good question on Twitter. They can't be used in contract negotiations yet, I don't think, right? Tracking database metrics. So you're always going to be a little limited because of the rules of the game, and I can understand why NFL teams are against that. To me, I think, it gets back to the O-line stuff, and it gets back to that paper that Tage and I just got published. It's going to go up on the Journal of Quantitative Analysis in Sports. I think you want to use it to help in player development. So if you're a linebacker and you came out of college and you bid on play action a lot. I want to know how much, and I want to know on what kind of plays, and I want to know, like, because then I can go to you and be like, look, man, I want to make you a good linebacker. So on 1st and 10, when the other team's running motion, you bite on play action 20% more than anybody else in the league, and you bite by a full yard more than anybody else. And if you could cut that down by half a yard and 10%, you're a Pro Bowl linebacker. Like, I want it to be like that. And I think in baseball, that's where it really took off. Because like early on with the A's, it was more of like, it was adversarial, right? Like, you're using analytics to try to get rid of me more quickly, right? Like even the Moneyball movie, a little bit dramatized, but that was the vibe. And then, Gabe Kapler, using the manager of the Giants now, he was like, you don't now use it to empower players to get better. And I think that to me, if somebody can do that, and they're doing that in a lot of teams, I know that for sure. Not all teams, not even the majority of them. But if you could use that to empower players to get better and say, look, on 1st down and 10 against speed rushers, you open up a half a yard more than the average tackle does, and you're vulnerable, right? And if you could just, the way that baseball players have done that with their pitch, sequencing and their pitch, where they put their fingers and all that kind of stuff, I think that is 100% where it finally clicks in the NFL, where data is not an adversary of existing paradigms.
Love that. And just so everyone knows, there are some excellent football coaches out there who are not good development talent people. I know that sounds a little odd, but it's for another topic, another conversation. But to be able to provide those coaches, any coach, the good ones and the ones that aren't into development, some of them, by the way, Eric, don't even have the patience to develop, right? They'd rather just bring in free agents. They don't want to bang their heads against the wall with some of the younger guys. This could be a massively important evolution, I think. And it's a whole really interesting topic.
Yeah, and it's really hard because there's 11 positions on the field, and so every one of those projects takes a long time to do. And so every NFL team, it's going to be hard. You've been in a front office before. You know how much stuff they have to do. In addition to that, that's why, of course, we want you all to come to Sumer Sports, give us your time, and obviously we'll help you with those things. This has been a lot of fun. I do have to, but before we leave, I do have to promote our sponsor, our new sponsor, Circa Sports. They are running a competition. They're running the Survivor Pool, Thomas, where every single week you pick one team and you say that team can't lose. And if they lose, you're eliminated. If they win, you move on. You can't pick the same team 2 times in 1 year. So it's a really fun competition, a ton in prizes there as well. And then they obviously have their traditional millions competition, where every single week you pick 5 games and whoever does the best at the end. And there are quarterly and half of the year prizes as well. Those people win cash prizes. We're very proud to be partnering with them, one of the best sports books in the entire world. And they have one of the coolest places in the entire world in Old Vegas with Stadium Swim, where you can watch 8 TVs at once while swimming in the pool. A very, very fun thing there. So we're very proud that they are one of our sponsors. Thomas, any words for the road?
No, I mean, this was great getting back. I can't wait. We're going to start building up as we're really close to camps before you know it. I know we're taking a little bit of a relaxed approach here, but I'm really excited about that. There's a lot to talk about. And, look, a lot of the questions that are coming in, we hadn't get a chance to answer, but as we start picking this back up, man, I'm excited about getting back 2 days a week, and hopefully we'll continue to do our part in helping to edify, and you guys can all edify us for sure through all your questions and comments.
Yeah, for sure. We always say we're going to talk for like 35 minutes, but obviously it always takes longer because there's so much to say. We really appreciate you all for coming. Again, subscribe, rate, and review. Send us a review. We always, I think, somebody came in and said, hey, put timestamps on the podcast. Somebody said, X, Y, and Z. And we really do want to try to make this podcast better. We think it's already great, but there's always time for improvement. We can't wait for the season to start. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.